She was just a secretary, walking into a glass tower on Boston's harbor, carrying nothing more than a notebook and a quiet smile. But sometimes the smallest step can set off the biggest storm. What happens when a woman who notices details no one else sees uncovers truths that could sink an empire? What happens when her kindness, mistaken for weakness, becomes the very courage that reshapes an entire industry? And what happens when love grows in the most dangerous place between a powerful CEO, known as Iron Ellison, and the one woman brave enough to stand against whispers, scandals, and the weight of a corporation determined to silence her? This is not just a story of boardrooms and battles. It's about dignity in small acts, about the price of truth, and about how a single smile, honest, unguarded, can change everything. Would you risk your name, your safety, even your future, for one smile that refuses to be forgotten? If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories so you never miss the next journey. Now, let's begin. She was just his secretary, until one smile changed his world. Sometimes the most ordinary morning can open a door to a life no one expects. Claire Whitman thought she was just starting another temp job, but the moment she walked into Ellison Maritime's headquarters, something inside her shifted. The air off the harbor carried the sharp bite of salt and metal, the kind of smell that clung to Boston's seaport even in late summer. Claire pulled her cardigan tighter as she hurried along the sidewalk, her leather bag pressing against her hip. Somerville already felt far behind her. The small apartment with its chipped kitchen tiles left quiet and dark. She had caught the early red line, switching to the silver line, and now she stood before a tower of glass and steel that seemed to hold the weight of the sky. Ellison Maritime Group. Letters in polished brass gleamed above the revolving doors. For years she had seen the building from a distance, when she rode buses past the seaport or walked along the harbor on weekends. It always looked unreachable, like a world made for people who wore tailored coats and carried phones that never stopped buzzing. Now she was expected inside, though only as a temporary secretary. Her heels clicked across marble so white it seemed almost blue under the high skylights. The lobby stretched upward, lined with glass that reflected the morning sun. To her left, a wall of windows revealed the harbor itself. Ships moving in the distance, cranes reaching toward the water, gulls darting across the sky. She felt small, as if she had stepped into a cathedral of commerce, where silence was replaced with the hum of elevators and the measured tones of receptionists answering calls. Claire gave her name at the desk, her voice steady, though her palms were damp. She had worked in offices before, small firms with fluorescent lights and thin carpet. Nothing like this. As she waited for her visitor badge, she caught her reflection in the glass behind the reception counter. Her hair, light brown with a stubborn wave, was pinned neatly at the back. Her blouse, simple ivory, was pressed carefully last night. Nothing about her appearance shouted ambition, but her eyes, gray-blue like a faded sea, held determination. A chime broke her thoughts. One of the elevators had opened, releasing a stream of executives, men in dark suits, women in sharp heels, each moving with purpose. Claire stepped aside, hugging her bag close. The crowd flowed around her, and then something unexpected happened. The elevator doors began to close, but a tall man stepped forward, holding them open with a single hand. His movements were precise, almost economical, as if he measured every gesture. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit as if cut from him alone. His hair, dark with just enough silver at the temples, framed a face that was striking in its restraint. Graham Ellison. She knew his name before anyone whispered it. The portraits in business magazines, the articles about shipping lanes and mergers. His face was unmistakable. He was the kind of man people lowered their voices around, the kind who carried authority without needing to raise his tone. And then, by accident, their eyes met. Claire had been shifting her bag, fumbling with the strap, and the movement made her lips curve into a small, almost embarrassed smile. A smile meant only to soften her own nerves, nothing more. Yet Graham paused, his eyes steel gray, sharp as the harbor in winter caught hers for a breath longer than necessary. It was nothing, an instant in a crowded lobby, but to Claire, it felt as if time had paused, allowing her smile to hover in the air between them. The doors closed, and he was gone. Her badge was ready, and she followed a young assistant to the 20th floor. The office smelled faintly of coffee and sea air drifting in through vents. She was shown a desk outside a corner office with frosted glass walls. Her tasks were clear: organize schedules, answer calls, prepare correspondence. Temporary work, the assistant reminded her. Though her contract could be extended if things went well, Claire settled in. She opened her notebook, lined with careful handwriting, and began transferring appointments from an overflowing paper calendar to a digital one. The previous secretary had left things in disarray, meetings doubled, calls unanswered, travel plans half-written. Claire's fingers moved quickly but calmly, creating order where there had been noise. Throughout the morning, she listened. She noted how often the phone rang before Graham answered. She saw the way he stepped out of his office, not rushing, but moving with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to explain himself. He rarely spoke more than a few words, but those words were precise, leaving no room for confusion. When she placed a file on his desk, he glanced up briefly. There was no greeting, no small talk, yet Claire sensed something unspoken in the way his gaze lingered for the briefest moment on the edges of the pages she had clipped neatly. The dates aligned, the handwriting clear. She wondered if he noticed the difference, if he realized the schedule that had once been chaos now ticked in steady rhythm. By late afternoon, she had learned small details. He drank his coffee black, but never more than 2 cups. He disliked pens that clicked, preferring fountain pens that glided in silence. He paused by the window before every meeting, his shoulders squared as he looked toward the harbor. These were ordinary things, the habits of a man buried in work. Yet, to Claire, they formed a sketch of someone human, someone carrying weight beneath the polish of authority. As the office emptied, Claire gathered her bag. She glanced once toward the corner office, where Graham Ellison stood alone at the window. His hands rested in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped behind cranes and steel. The city glowed with fading light, the harbor catching streaks of orange and gold. Claire slipped quietly into the elevator, unaware that Graham had turned from the glass. He was not thinking of schedules or quarterly reports. Instead, he found himself replaying a smile, small, uncalculated, genuine. A smile that should have vanished among countless meetings and signatures. But it had not. It lingered, and for the first time in years, he felt unsettled, wondering why something so simple refused to let him go. In a company where everyone chased his approval, Claire found her way by noticing what no one else cared to see. The echo of that first day still sat in her chest, a small, steadying drumbeat. She carried it into the morning like a private vow. Do the quiet work well, and let the noise pass by. She began with the calendar. It looked like a crowded harbor at low-tide meetings stacked so tight there was no channel left for thinking. She studied the week the way sailors study weather. Blocks of time were strangled by back-to-back calls, each scheduled by a different hand. She trimmed the excess, nudged long status updates into short written notes, and protected a harbor of silence each morning. 90 minutes, unbroken. She labeled it simply deep work. No one needed to know more. She marked travel with real time instead of wishful thinking. No more 15-minute sprints across town when Boston traffic turned those minutes into an hour. She added 5-minute buffers before each meeting because she had watched him stand at the window and gather himself. The buffers were a respectful pause, the way one might hold open a door without calling attention to the gesture. By mid-morning, she touched the files. Paper told its own stories in the way it wore down. Corners curled from too many hands, sticky notes layered like barnacles. She peeled back the mess, slide by slide, contracts in one drawer, vendor histories in another, each folder named with dates first, then subjects. She chose a color code that would make sense even in gray-light green for routine, amber for watch, red for risk. She did not announce the system. She let it sit there. Legible as a lighthouse once your eyes adjusted. Email triage came next. She sorted by what moved ships, not egos, crew rosters, insurance renewals, dock assignments. A message chain about office paint stayed at the bottom, where it belonged. She deleted nothing, but she fed the right items forward. Graham's inbox trickled into his day in a narrow, useful stream instead of a flood. The invoice caught her eye because it leaned. Numbers usually stood straight when they were true. This one tilted, a vendor charged for retrofit work on a vessel that, according to the date stamped on the bill, hadn't yet cleared the Narrows. Claire didn't have access to full tracking systems, but she had enough a daily arrival sheet, maintenance logs, the timestamp on a crew lunch receipt tucked into a file. She lined them up on her desk like spines on a shelf. The times didn't agree. She made a small note in the margin, not an accusation, just a question a careful person would ask. Then she filed the invoice under amber, not red. She believed in the dignity of being wrong first in private. Graham's day moved differently under the new order. Meetings ended when they should. Calls arrived with space enough between them to consider answers rather than react. His coffee cooled slowly while he wrote, the steam not chased away by constant interruptions. He didn't call attention to the change, but he noticed the peculiar sensation of reaching the end of an afternoon and still having himself left. When he stepped out for a document, he paused at the cabinet. New tabs, new labels, a calm logic. He lifted a file and found a one-page summary, paper-clipped to the top dates, totals, and 3 lines in plain language, green, amber, red. He would have expected the neatness from a consultant with a fee. He did not expect it from the woman outside his door, who answered phones with a soft hello and wore the same cardigan twice a week. Claire moved with the quiet of a librarian at closing time. She rewound the office without erasing its story. She replaced the clicking pens with pens that slid. She tucked a small box of paper clips into the drawer where his left hand always searched. She left the blinds at an angle that kept glare off the desk at 4 in the afternoon. These were not ambitions, they were care. Late that day, an expense summary arrived from accounting. Claire was not responsible for approvals, but the numbers touched the same vendor as the leaning invoice. She read slowly. A second line item repeated the same service description on a different vessel. Same month, almost the same amount. She checked the docking notes again. One ship had been in port. The other had been at sea. She felt the smallest chill and pressed her thumb to the paper's edge. It was not proof. It was pattern. She circled nothing, because circles accuse. Instead, she used the corner of a sticky note to tag the page amber and slid it back where it belonged. A secretary's job, she reminded herself, was to hold the threads without tangling them. Still, she could not unknot the feeling. At noon, she protected something no one had protected in months the window before Graham's largest weekly review. She let it breathe. The review began on time and ended with decisions instead of deferrals. When he looked up afterward, his gaze met the neat stack she had prepared for the next hour. Green on top, amber beneath, red at the bottom, alone, because red should never get lost. He took the amber folder with a slight narrowing of his eyes. He didn't open it there. He carried it into his office and closed the door with the same quiet finality he used for everything else. Claire exhaled and returned to the slow work that made fast work possible. In the late afternoon, a memo slid across her desk in the internal mail. Ballast retrofit certifications. The subject line read, resolved. The word had been stamped in confident blue. Her chest tightened the way it does when a step looks sturdy, but wobbles underfoot. She read the paragraph twice. It referenced audits completed, boxes checked, targets met. It did not mention dates. It did not mention which vessels, which ports, which days. She laid the memo near the invoices without letting them touch. The harbor wind sneaked through the vents, carrying brine and a thin trace of diesel. Out past the glass, cranes stilled as evening took the edge off the light. She could feel the building settling around her the way a ship settles when the wake passes. She wrote 3 words on a small slip of paper and tucked it into her notebook. Check the times. It was a promise to herself rather than a declaration. The workday thinned, phones quieted, The janitor's cart squeaked somewhere down the hall. Claire stacked the calendars cleanly, aligned the pens, and shut down her computer with the slow, respectful motion of a person leaving a room that had given her something. The memo remained on her desk when she stood to go. Resolved, it insisted. The word felt like paint over wood that had begun to rot, smooth to the touch, hollow underneath. She slipped the memo into the amber folder and placed it on the corner of her blotter, where morning light would find it first. Then she stepped into the hallway and felt the faint shake of an elevator arriving, somewhere behind the frosted glass. Graham stood again at the window, the harbor turning dark and silver. He could not have named why his shoulders felt less armored, only that they did. On her walk to the train, Claire kept replaying the tilt of those numbers. The city smelled like rain coming. A gull cackled at something invisible. She pulled her cardigan close and told herself to sleep. But even as the station swallowed her, the stamped word glowed at the edge of her mind like a buoy that refused to go out. Tomorrow, she would check the times. A company may measure profits in millions, but Claire believed dignity lived in the smallest details. It was a gray morning, the kind that pressed the harbor flat and dull. Claire arrived early, her shoes damp from mist on the pavement. The office was still half asleep, lights buzzing on one floor at a time. She set her bag on her desk, unwrapped a small muffin she had carried from home, and opened the day's internal reports. Most of it was routine budget adjustments, docking schedules, maintenance notes. Then one entry caught her eye. It was buried near the bottom, labeled Employee Benefits Pending Review. The name beside it, Samuel Ortiz, status deceased. The date was nearly 6 months old. Claire frowned. She turned the page, checking for updates. There were none. She searched the database with the careful patience she brought to all her tasks. The system showed a stipend promised to his widow, still unissued. Pending review had become a placeholder that no one bothered to clear. She closed her eyes for a moment. To most people, it was just a line on a screen, one more box and a ledger. But she pictured a woman waiting for a check that never came, perhaps adjusting bills at her kitchen table, wondering if she had been forgotten. Claire reached for stationery, not corporate letterhead, but plain ivory paper she had purchased herself. In her rounded script, she wrote, "On behalf of Ellison Maritime, we extend our deepest condolences on your loss. We honor the years Mr. Ortiz gave to this company and to the sea he served." She folded the page carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it beside the benefit file. Her next stop was the lobby. Along the west wall stood a bronze plaque etched with the names of employees lost at sea or to accidents on the docks. Visitors walked past it without pausing, their eyes drawn instead to the glitter of glass above the reception desk. Dust filmed the letters. A bulb overhead had burned out, leaving the top corner in shadow. Claire stood quietly with a tissue in hand, rubbing the bronze until the names shone again. Halfway down the column, she saw it, Samuel Ortiz, spelled Ortez. One letter wrong, but enough to twist memory. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and wrote down the correction, back upstairs. She called facilities and asked about maintenance on the plaque lighting. The man on the line sounded surprised anyone had noticed. "We'll get to it," he muttered. She thanked him anyway. By mid-morning, the office had woken. Phones rang, heels clicked, conversations sharpened. Graham passed her desk twice, heading to and from meetings. She greeted him with a nod, returning to her work without demanding his attention. He had grown accustomed to employees angling for his glance, his favor, his approval. Claire was different. She poured her care into the overlooked corners, calendars aligned, invoices checked, and now even the names of the dead remembered. When he returned from lunch, he noticed the file on his desk, the stipend, with her neat handwriting attached, a condolence letter, unsigned, left as suggestion. He read it twice. Something stirred beneath his practiced composure, a memory of standing at a graveside years ago, the soil heavy with rain, the silence unbroken by words that might have eased him. He set the paper down more gently than he intended. That evening, as most of the staff hurried out, Graham lingered in the lobby. He rarely stopped near the plaque. It had become background, part of the architecture. But now his eyes followed the bronze, the way the light caught where someone had polished. His gaze settled on the name Newly Bright, and then he saw the slip, Ortes. He felt his jaw tighten. Mr. Ellison, he turned. Claire stood a few steps back, her bag slung over her shoulder. Her voice was quiet. It should be Ortiz. I made a note for facilities. Her face was calm, not defensive. She wasn't reporting for credit. She was explaining, as if the dignity of one man's memory was simply part of her job. For a moment, Graham couldn't speak. His executives had combed through budgets worth millions, but none had paused to correct a single letter carved in bronze. And yet, this secretary, with her cardigans and her quiet presence, had carried a truth they had all missed. He nodded once. "Good," he said, though the word felt too small. Claire offered a gentle smile, the kind that asked for nothing in return, and stepped toward the doors. The harbor wind rushed in as she left, scattering the day's tension with the salt of evening air. Graham remained before the plaque. The wrong letter still stared back at him, but he knew it would not remain wrong for long. He thought about the woman upstairs who had polished the names of strangers, who had seen a pending stipend not as a number, but as a life waiting. For the first time in years, he felt a shift in the building's air. Not profit, not strategy, but something quieter, humanity. As he stood there, a thought crossed his mind, unwelcome yet undeniable. Maybe she belonged here more than anyone else. On a Saturday when most would rest, Claire found herself standing by a dockside door with grocery bags for a sailor's family. The morning air was sharp with salt and the faint bitterness of diesel. Seagulls wheeled overhead, crying against the gray sky. Claire balanced 2 paper sacks in her arms, the bottoms soft from the weight of milk and bread, canned soup and apples. She had learned, through whispers in the office, that a deckhand named Michael Torres had been badly injured in a fall. His wife, Anna, was home with 2 small children and little help. The stipend process would grind forward eventually, but hunger did not wait for paperwork. Claire walked up the narrow path to a weathered house that leaned slightly toward the sea. She knocked. Anna answered with tired eyes and a baby balanced on her hip. At first, she hesitated, her guard raised the way people do when pride collides with need. But when she saw the groceries, her shoulders softened. From the company she asked, Claire shook her head. "From me, just so you don't have to think about supper tonight." Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of boiled coffee. The older child, a boy of 6, peeked from behind the doorway. Claire crouched to hand him an apple. His fingers clutched it as if it were treasure. Anna's eyes shimmered. She pressed Claire's hand once, silently, before turning back to her children. Claire walked away with the ocean breeze pulling at her hair. It wasn't grand, what she had done, but dignity lived in such small mercies. On Monday, she returned to the tower. The building's lobby gleamed as always, but Claire carried with her the memory of that little boy's hand on the apple. At her desk, she opened her notebook and began sketching an idea. She had noticed that many employees worked late into the night, ordering greasy takeout or skipping meals altogether. Complaints found their way into HR, small but constant, about long hours and empty stomachs. Claire thought of Anna, thought of the boy. Hunger, she knew, was not a minor thing. She drafted what she called a quiet policy. No announcements, no fanfare, just a simple directive anyone working beyond 9 p.m. could expense a modest meal or claim a cab ride home. She cleared it through a mid-level HR contact with minimal fuss. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had shifted. People who once grumbled found themselves calmer. Petty arguments dulled. Productivity nudged upward, though Claire didn't need charts to see it. The change rippled upward. On Tuesday, Graham noticed that his review sessions moved more smoothly, with fewer frayed tempers. On Wednesday, a supervisor commented that over time, crews seemed steadier. Graham did not at first connect it to Claire, But when he saw her filing receipts with quiet precision, his suspicion grew. Late one afternoon, he lingered by her desk. "These meal claims," he said, his voice low. "You arrange this?" Claire looked up, calm. It seemed fair. People do better when they're cared for. Graham studied her, searching for any trace of calculation. There was none, only steady conviction. He felt a stir of something he had not allowed himself for years, respect touched by tenderness. But the warmth of her gesture was soon pressed against the cold edge of business. CFO Martin Caldwell arrived at Graham's office with spreadsheets and urgency. His tone was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice meant to lull listeners into compliance. "We need accelerated sign-offs," Caldwell insisted. "Retrofit certifications push through before quarter close. Investors are watching. Delay means weakness." Graham frowned. "Safety inspections take time." "Time we don't have," Caldwell countered. "The numbers look strong, but only if we meet these targets. A few signatures, and we're covered." Outside, Claire was sorting mail when she heard the edge in Caldwell's voice through the partially open door. She stilled, her hand resting on a stack of envelopes. She could not hear every word, but the urgency was clear. Papers slid across the desk, Caldwell's tone pressing harder. When the meeting ended, Graham stepped out, his jaw tight. Claire noticed. His eyes found hers for a moment, and something passed between them, unspoken, but weighty. That evening, as the office emptied, Claire remained. The glow of her desk lamp cast a circle of light while she reviewed schedules and invoices. She wrote notes in her careful script, aligning columns, smoothing chaos. The quiet was her companion, broken only by the distant hum of cleaning staff. Near midnight, she closed her notebook. Her shoulders ached, but her mind was still restless. She reached for her email one last time before shutting down, and there it was. A subject line blinking in bold ballast retrofit certifications resolved. The word struck her like a warning buoy flashing in the dark. Resolved? It sounded final, but too easy, too quick. She remembered Caldwell's urgency, the way he pressed for speed. She leaned back in her chair, the glow of the screen painting her face in pale light. She pressed her fingertips together, thinking of Anna and the boy with the apple, of all the unseen lives beneath the numbers. If shortcuts touched safety, the risk was not abstract. It was flesh and blood. She closed the email, but its echo followed her home, threading through the quiet streets of Somerville as the city slept. In her bag, the notebook rested heavy. She knew she would return to the subject tomorrow. She could not let the glow of that warning buoy fade. Some truths do not announce themselves loudly. They whisper from mismatched numbers and times that never line up. Claire knew something was deeply wrong. It began with a habit she had formed in her first weeks lining up invoices against docking logs. She told herself it was for practice, a way to learn the rhythm of the company. But her mind worked like a clockmaker's gears had to fit. Minutes had to match, and these numbers did not. The invoice in front of her claimed a ballast retrofit on the Mary Ellen dated September 12th. But the vessel had not even cleared the harbor until the evening of September 13th, according to the AIS, the automatic identification system every ship reported. The log from the dock showed arrival at 2:14. How, Claire wondered, could work be completed on a ship that had not yet returned? She rubbed her temple, reading again. A single mistake could be excused. But when she pulled 3 more invoices, her stomach tightened. The same vendor, the same pattern. Work signed and billed before ships were even in port. It was as though the paper lived in a world separate from the water. Claire opened a fresh folder from her drawer, a soft leather one she had bought with her own money. She wrote retrofit review on the tab in her neat block letters. Into it, she slid the invoices, copies of docking schedules, and AIS snapshots she had printed from the daily feeds. Her hand trembled slightly as she clipped the pages together. She was only a secretary. She had no mandate to audit, no authority to accuse. But she also knew silence could make her complicit. All day she carried the folder in her bag, feeling its weight against her side. In meetings, she took notes as usual, her expression calm, but the numbers throbbed in the back of her mind like an untended wound. That evening, she stayed after most had gone. The office hummed with low lights, the cleaners moving slowly down the hallway. She laid the papers out across her desk, aligning dates and figures. On one sheet, she made a timeline docking times, invoices, completion dates. The lines refused to meet. She imagined what it meant. If certifications were forged, the ships carried risk ballast tanks unchecked, safety unproven. If the Coast Guard discovered it, penalties could reach millions. If accidents occurred, lives could be lost. She pressed her pen to the page and wrote the words she could no longer avoid. Systemic fraud suspected. Then she stopped, staring at the ink. She tore the sheet into strips and dropped them into the bin. She could not accuse. Not yet. She would only show the facts. The next morning, Graham Ellison moved through his schedule with the same quiet authority. He did not notice Claire's sidelong glances, the way she seemed to weigh whether to speak. He only noticed that meetings ran smoothly, documents arrived on time, and his desk carried no chaos. Near noon, she made her choice. She gathered the papers into the leather folder, smoothed her blouse, and walked into his office without knocking. He looked up from a report, one eyebrow raised. "This should be seen," she said simply, setting the folder before him. Then she turned and left. Graham rested his hand on the leather cover. For a long moment he did not open it. He recognized the weight of intent when he saw it. Finally he drew the folder close and began to read. The invoices lay in tidy order, each paired with docking logs and AIS timestamps. Claire had not written accusations, only placed facts side by side. Yet the pattern was clear: work billed before arrival, certifications issued without evidence. His jaw tightened. Millions in liability could sit inside those mismatched numbers. More than that, lives. A ship certified without work could become a coffin at sea. He closed the folder and stared out the window. The harbor was bright with sun, cranes dipping like iron birds. He thought of his father, who had built the company on sweat and salt. He thought of men lost in storms because corners had been cut by others. And now, under his name, the same shadow crept. The door opened without a knock. Martin Caldwell stepped in, smiling as though the air itself belonged to him. "Afternoon, Graham," he said smoothly. "I trust the week is treating you well?" Graham did not rise. He kept a hand on the folder. "What do you need?" Martin Caldwell's smile deepened. "Only to remind you of opportunity. Investors are hungry. We can't afford delays. The retrofit sign-offs must move quickly. Confidence depends on speed." Graham narrowed his eyes. "Speed without safety isn't confidence. It's a gamble." Caldwell spread his hands. "Details, details. We're all on the same side here. I know you're cautious, but sometimes leadership means trusting the people paid to deliver." His glance flicked toward the folder. "Too much digging only makes waves." There it was, the subtle threat, wrapped in silk. When Caldwell left, the office felt colder. Graham sat in silence, the leather folder still before him. He thought again of the smile that had unsettled him weeks ago, the one that had cracked his armor. He thought of Claire, who had no reason to risk herself except conscience. The lights dimmed as evening approached, staff thinned. Only a few floors still glowed against the harbor dusk. Claire packed her bag, her steps steady, though her heart was not. She knew what she had placed on his desk was more dangerous than any word she could have spoken. Graham remained at the window, the folder between him and the city. It sat there like a weapon loaded not with bullets but with truth. A single decision could fire it toward ruin or toward redemption. And as night fell, both of them understood. Though neither said it aloud, the numbers on those pages could sink a ship. It takes only a whisper to shake a woman's reputation. Claire discovered how fast a smile could be twisted into scandal. The morning began as any other. She set her bag on the desk, smoothed her skirt, and opened her notebook. But the atmosphere in the office felt different, as though the air itself held a charge. People avoided her eyes. Conversations hushed when she passed. Claire brushed it aside, telling herself it was her imagination. Until the call came, human resources would like to see you. The HR office smelled faintly of oatmeal carpet and overbrewed tea. A woman with sharp glasses and a colder smile gestured for Claire to sit. The questions began politely, almost blandly. How long had she been employed? What was her relationship with Mr. Ellison? Did she often stay late? Did she accompany him outside the building? Each inquiry wore the costume of routine, yet beneath it ran suspicion. Claire answered calmly, hands folded in her lap, but her heart thudded against her ribs. She thought of the leather folder on Graham's desk, of numbers that pointed toward fraud. Was this questioning a coincidence or something else? When she returned to her desk, she found her computer screen locked. Her password no longer worked. A message appeared. Access restricted, temporary review. She tried again, slower this time. The same result. Her stomach sank. To lose access meant more than inconvenience. It meant isolation. By afternoon, the reason surfaced. The PR team had intercepted a photograph, a long lens shot of Graham and Claire standing too close on a windy pier. Her hair had blown across her face, and in the frozen image, it looked as though Graham leaned near to brush it aside. The narrative was easy to spin: inappropriate closeness, favoritism, whispers of scandal. Claire stared at the printed photo, her cheeks hot. It was nothing more than a moment of weather, a gust of New England wind. Yet the story it told was one she could not erase. Caldwell arrived soon after, his voice smooth, his tone laced with false concern. "These things happen," he said, standing too casually at Graham's office door. "Rumors, photos taken out of context. Best not to stir it further. Containment is the word. We should all remain silent, let it fade." Graham's jaw flexed. His silence was not agreement, but fury held in check. Claire saw the muscle twitch near his temple, the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk. But he said nothing. She knew why. To lash out would feed the fire. To protect her openly would deepen suspicion. That evening, Claire tried to log in once more. Again, access denied. She sat at her desk long after others left, staring at the dark screen. The office around her hummed with fluorescent light, the janitor's cart squeaking down the hall. She felt the walls lean inward. Her phone buzzed with messages from unknown numbers. Some offered sympathy. Others carried sharp edges cloaked as curiosity. "Is it true, did you—" She set the phone face down, pressing her palms to her eyes. Graham passed her desk on his way out. He paused, looking down at her with an expression she could not read. Anger, frustration, a helpless kind of care. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "This isn't about you." But Claire knew it was, or at least she had become the tool, a way to weaken him, to distract him, to discredit the truth she had uncovered. She thought again of the invoices, the mismatched times, the word resolve stamped where nothing had been resolved. If those papers came to light, someone would fall, and whoever that someone was, they had struck first. The realization settled over her like cold rain. The rumor was not an accident. It was the first blow of a planned campaign. She had been marked. The next morning, HR called her in again. More questions, colder this time. They asked if she had accepted gifts, if she had traveled with Graham, if she had any receipts to declare. Claire answered steadily, but each word felt like standing on glass. When the meeting ended, she stood in the hallway with her badge still clipped to her blouse. Her legs wanted to buckle, but she made them move, step after step. She walked out into the harbor air, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Her badge still hung around her neck, the symbol of belonging not yet stripped away. But in her heart, a new certainty had taken root. Someone was coming after her, and they would not stop with whispers. A single leak turned whispers into a storm, and Claire realized her name had become headline fodder. The first headline appeared on a Tuesday morning, bold across the screen of a business blog: Iron Ellison's secretary, more than just a smile. The article recycled the photograph from the pier, the gust of wind twisted into intimacy, her presence painted as influence. The words dripped with innuendo: close confidant, fast-track promotion, questions of favoritism. By mid-morning, the story had spread. National outlets carried it with varying shades of scandal, some hinting at impropriety, others speculating about corporate governance. By noon, television crews were parked outside Ellison Maritime's headquarters, their cameras aimed at the revolving doors. Inside the glass tower, tension pulsed through every floor. Employees whispered in break rooms, eyes darting to Claire's empty desk. Stock tickers slid downward, each point lost like a bead of sweat. The company's name, once steady as steel, now trembled under the weight of rumor. Claire, however, was not there to see it. She sat in her Somerville apartment, blinds drawn, the glow of her phone lighting the small kitchen. Notifications piled up, texts from former coworkers, emails from reporters, even a message from a high school acquaintance she hadn't spoken to in years. Curiosity, judgment, pity. They all blurred together until she silenced the phone and pressed it face down on the table. The apartment was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between her thoughts. On the counter sat a cup of tea gone cold. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the cracked tiles she had never gotten around to fixing. Shame pressed against her chest, sharp and heavy. Yet beneath it flickered something harder, angrier. She had given nothing but diligence, care, truth, and for that, she had been made into spectacle. Meanwhile, Graham faced the storm from within the tower. The board demanded explanations. Caldwell spoke of reputational damage, urging decisive distance from the secretary at the center of scandal. Leadership requires sacrifice, he said smoothly, as if the sacrifice should be Claire. Graham listened, his face composed, but inside his fury roiled. He knew what Claire had uncovered, the leather folder now locked in his drawer. He knew the danger it posed to those who profited from deceit. This scandal was not about a smile. It was a weapon aimed at silencing truth. He shielded her in silence, refusing to feed the media frenzy. Yet every hour of his restraint cost him ground with the board. Investors called, their voices clipped, questioning confidence. Workers muttered on the docks, uneasy under scrutiny. The company he had built on his father's legacy strained under the weight of a lie. That night, Claire sat at her small table with the blinds still drawn. The city outside moved on without her, horns blaring, footsteps on sidewalks, the red line rumbling beneath the streets. She felt both invisible and exposed, as though the whole world stared through her windows. Her phone buzzed again. This time the message was short, unsigned. If you care for him, walk away. If you stay, he falls. Claire read the words twice, her hand tightening around the phone. It was not curiosity, not gossip. It was a warning or a threat. Either way, it revealed intent. Someone wanted her gone, not because of rumor, but because of what she knew. She stood, walking to the window. Slowly she pulled the blinds aside. The night air shimmered with Boston's lights, the harbor glowing with red and green signals, cranes frozen against the dark. She watched the reflection of the water, her own face faint in the glass. For a moment, she thought of packing a bag, leaving the city, vanishing back into anonymity. She thought of how easy it would be to disappear, to let the story fade without her presence. But the idea turned her stomach. Running would not clear her name. It would only hand victory to those who had twisted it. She let the blinds fall back into place. Her breath steadied. She could not walk away from truth, however costly it became. The storm outside had only begun, but Claire felt the resolve harden within her. The harbor lights still shone, steady against the night, and she decided, quietly but firmly, that she would stand. The mahogany table became a courtroom, and Claire the reluctant witness. She sat at one end, the polished surface stretching before her like an endless road. Around it, the board of Ellison Maritime gathered faces stern, eyes sharp, men and women who measured their power not in words, but in the weight of silence. At the far end sat Graham, shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. A pitcher of water glistened in the center, untouched. The room smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. a blend of formality and tension. Claire folded her hands in her lap to still their trembling. She was not here to defend herself alone. She was here because truth had no other voice. The questions began softly, like taps on glass. Her resume, her previous jobs, how long she had been with the company. Each inquiry laced with skepticism, the implication clear she was unqualified, too ordinary for the leap she had made. When the questions turned, the tone sharpened. Did Mr. Ellison show you favoritism? Why were you given responsibilities beyond your role? Words like ambition and influence slipped into the air, twisted to suggest manipulation. Claire's throat felt dry, but she lifted her chin. Yes, she said, her voice steady, though her chest ached. I love Graham Ellison. A rustle swept around the table, chairs shifting, eyebrows lifting. She let the silence linger before continuing. But every report, every correction, every number I presented I did on my own. My work stands apart from my heart. From her briefcase she drew a folder, its edges worn from nights of study. One by one, she spread documents across the gleaming surface. Ship logs, lined with her careful annotations. Vendor invoices marked with red circles where hours and dates could never have matched. Color-coded charts tracing patterns of risk ignored or dismissed. The papers whispered as they slid across the table, louder than any voice. Board members leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the evidence. A few exchanged glances, calculation flickering behind their practiced expressions. Graham spoke then, his voice low but firm. If this company requires my resignation to protect its reputation, you shall have it. The words hung heavy. Claire turned to him, her heart twisting. He was willing to fall so she might stand, but she could not let him bear that weight. She rose to her feet. The board members followed her every movement. She placed her palms lightly on the table, steadying herself against its cold surface. No, she said softly, then louder. No, if someone must resign, it will be me. Gasps circled the room. Claire continued, her voice gathering strength. I cannot work under shadows and suspicion, but I also cannot walk away from what I have built here. That is why I offer something different. She slid another document onto the table, her own draft, drawn late at night. I will resign as an employee, but I propose to remain as an independent consultant, paid by contract, not by salary, accountable to results, not rumor. That way, my work speaks for itself, without question of favoritism. Her words struck like a gavel. For a moment, even the hum of the air system seemed to still. The board members stared, measuring her audacity. She felt their scrutiny press against her skin. But she did not waver. Across the table, Graham's eyes softened, a flicker of admiration breaking through his controlled mask. The silence stretched long, as if the whole company's fate balanced on the edge of her proposal. And when Claire finally lowered herself back into her chair, her pulse racing, she knew she had shifted something in the room. The board was no longer judging her alone. They were weighing the courage it took to place her future and theirs on the same line. The mahogany table gleamed under the lights, a courtroom no longer, but a place where choice was being carved. And as the minutes ticked by, no one spoke, the weight of her offer hanging over them all. Sometimes survival depends on a single raised hand. The boardroom held its breath. The mahogany table glowed under the ceiling lights, polished smooth like still water, reflecting the stack of papers Claire had placed there, the evidence, the resignation, the proposal that might save them all or ruin everything. Silence stretched, not the comfortable silence of thought, but the taut, unbearable kind that makes seconds feel like hours. Claire sat with her back straight, though her palms pressed damp against her skirt. Across from her, Graham's jaw was set, his expression unreadable. Caldwell leaned slightly back in his chair, lips curved in a faint smile, as if certain the outcome had already been decided. Finally, it was Lydia Hartwell who broke the silence. Lydia, a board member with silver hair pulled neatly into a chignon, her pearls catching the light. She had spoken little in earlier debates, Choosing to observe, weighing more than she revealed, now she leaned forward, her hands clasped. "I believe," Lydia said softly, but with unmistakable clarity, "that Miss Whitman's proposal is the only path that preserves both integrity and continuity. I vote in favor." The room shifted. A chair creaked. A cough sounded at the far end. One by one, faces turned from Lydia to Claire, then to Graham. Another hand rose, then another, hesitant at first, as though the act itself carried risk. But gradually, conviction spread, like fire catching along dry timber. Hands lifted, shoulders straightened. Caldwell's smile faltered. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep breathing evenly. She thought of the nights at her kitchen table in Somerville, poring over invoices and logs. She thought of the widow's stipend she had pushed through, the memorial plaque she had corrected. None of it had been grand. All of it had been true. And now, truth was finally finding its voice in this room. The chairman cleared his throat, his mustache twitching with the weight of formality. "The motion stands. All in favor of accepting Miss Whitman's resignation and entering into a consulting contract under the proposed structure, raise your hand." 12 hands rose, firm, unshaken, all opposed. Only 3 hands remained lowered, Caldwell's among them. The gavel struck wood with a sharp crack. Motion carries. It was done. Claire exhaled, her body trembling with the release of tension she hadn't realized she carried. She stood slowly, gathering her folder, her resignation letter already signed. She placed it neatly before the chairman, her hand steady. "I resign as an employee," she said, her voice calm, though her pulse still raced. "But I will honor my commitment to this company as consultant. On results alone, no one interrupted, no one questioned." Caldwell shifted in his seat, his face pale now, the confidence drained. The chairman turned his gaze to him. "Mr. Caldwell, in light of recent evidence and the concerns raised, we will open an internal review of your department's oversight, effective immediately." The words landed like stone. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Graham's eyes never left Claire. He had prepared himself to lose everything: his position, his reputation, even the company his father had built. Instead, he had witnessed her courage turn the tide. Yet what moved him most was not victory, but the quiet dignity with which she carried it. The meeting adjourned, papers shuffled, chairs scraped, footsteps echoed against the polished floor. One by one, the board members filed out, their voices low, already calculating what came next. Claire lingered a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. Then she walked toward the door, the leather soles of her shoes tapping softly on the wood. In the corridor, the air felt different, thinner, cooler, touched with the faint scent of waxed floors and the echo of distant voices. She paused at the tall windows, looking out. The harbor stretched dark and wide, lights shimmering on its surface. Behind her, Graham stepped out of the boardroom. For a moment they simply looked at each other, no words passing between them, no longer employer and secretary, no longer titan and subordinate. Something had shifted, irrevocable and undeniable. Claire lifted her chin, her breath fogging faintly against the cool glass. Graham's eyes held hers, not commanding, not guarded, but open. They walked side by side toward the elevator. The building's lights glowed against the night, but outside, the evening air waited cold, bracing, honest. And when the doors opened, Claire stepped forward, not as an employee leaving her post, but as an equal stepping into a future that had only just begun. Sometimes walking away is not loss. It is the beginning of a better road. Claire's new life began not in a gleaming office tower, but in her modest Somerville apartment. The desk she used was the same oak table she had once eaten takeout on, its surface worn by years of use. She cleared space for her laptop, stacks of binders, and the second-hand printer she bought online for $30. It was not much, but it was hers. She named it Whitman Consulting, typed those 2 words at the top of a document, and stared at them for a long moment. They looked small on the screen, almost fragile, Yet behind them lived her determination. Every late night spent cross-checking numbers. Every quiet act of care that no one else had thought important. Her first clients were not glamorous. A small shipping outfit on the South Shore, a tugboat service with outdated logs, a family-owned marina struggling with compliance paperwork. They paid modestly, sometimes late, but they gave her something more precious than money trust. Claire built her reputation on transparency. She showed clients the gaps in their records, taught them how to correct errors, and left them stronger than she found them. Word spread, slowly but steadily. The days blurred into one another. Morning coffee at her kitchen table, her phone buzzing with calls. Afternoons spent visiting gritty offices near the docks, where the scent of salt water clung to walls and boots left tracks of mud on linoleum floors. Evenings back at her apartment, the glow of her laptop screen filling the room until midnight. She filed reports, adjusted spreadsheets, and sent emails long after the city outside had gone quiet. Exhaustion weighed heavy, but underneath it lived a fierce determination. She had walked away from Ellison Maritime with her name bruised, but she refused to let it be broken. Each completed project became a stone in the foundation she was laying, not only for herself, but for a way of doing business that was honest and humane. Graham watched from a careful distance. He called rarely, visited even less, but she knew he followed her progress. When they did speak, his words carried respect, not pity. He never tried to overshadow her, never attempted to fold her back under the shelter of his empire. He seemed to understand that her strength required space to grow. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in, nights when she stared at her bank account, the balance dipping lower than she dared admit. Nights when fatigue blurred the numbers on the screen, and she wondered if she had traded stability for a dream too fragile to survive. On those nights, she would walk to the harbor, the cool wind against her face, and remind herself that freedom was worth its cost. Her breakthrough came 6 months later. She had been contracted to review a series of safety protocols for a mid-sized operator. What she uncovered was alarming gaps in inspection reports, outdated ballast calculations, records that could have placed lives at risk. She documented every detail, presented her findings, and braced herself for the pushback she expected. Instead, the report reached the Coast Guard, and in a public bulletin, her system of cross-checking logs and invoices was cited as a model for transparency. Her name appeared in the notice, Whitman Consulting, in bold letters. Claire read the bulletin twice, her hands trembling. The recognition was not about pride, but about validation. The industry could no longer dismiss her as a secretary who smiled too kindly. They had to see her as what she had become, a professional whose methods carried weight. Calls came in quickly after that. Companies that had once ignored her now asked for meetings. Colleagues who had doubted her sent cautious congratulations. For the first time since leaving Ellison Maritime, she felt the tide turn in her favor. One morning, unable to sleep, she walked to the harbor at dawn. The air was sharp with salt, the water reflecting shades of pink and gold as the sun climbed. Fishing boats drifted out, their engines low hums in the distance. She stood on the edge, the chill biting through her coat, and let the sound of gulls and waves fill her. She realized then that she had carved her own place, not handed down, not borrowed from another's power, but built with her own hands. The harbor, once a backdrop to her fears, now felt like home ground, and as the first light of day stretched across the water, Claire understood that she was no longer only surviving. She was beginning. After storms, calm seas feel almost holy. Graham chose this moment for the question he had carried. 18 months had passed since the boardroom trial that had changed everything. Time had not erased the scars, but it had shaped them into strength. Whitman Consulting now filled more than Claire's kitchen table. She had rented a small office above a bakery in Cambridge, the scent of fresh bread seeping through the floorboards each morning. A brass plate on the door bore her name, simple and unpretentious. Clients came steadily, drawn by her reputation for honesty and diligence. She managed a small team, now 2 assistants and a junior analyst, people she trusted to carry the same quiet integrity. Ellison Maritime Group had transformed as well. With Graham insisting on transparent audits and renewed safety practices, the company regained stability. Workers felt seen. Ships ran smoother, and contracts once at risk returned. Caldwell, once so smug, had been forced into early retirement under investigation. His absence left a shadow, but one that grew fainter as new leadership filled the void. For all their progress, Claire and Graham remained careful with one another. They spoke occasionally, always with respect, always with a quiet awareness of the bond that had grown between them. Yet neither pushed. She was no longer his secretary. He was no longer her shield. They were two people learning how to walk beside one another, without one overshadowing the other. It was Graham who reached out at last. His voice over the phone was steady, but softer than she remembered. "Would you join me for a walk, Cape Ann, the lighthouse?" The drive north carried them through winding coastal roads, past rocky shores and weathered houses painted in white and gray. The sea stretched wide and glittering under a late autumn sun. Claire wore a wool coat, her hands tucked deep in the pockets, her scarf whipped gently by the breeze. Graham walked beside her, his stride measured, his presence familiar, yet new. The lighthouse stood tall against the sky, its white tower bright against the blue. They followed the path down to the rocks where waves crashed, sending spray into the air. Gulls circled above, their cries sharp and wild. The air smelled of salt and pine, clean and bracing. For a while, they spoke of ordinary things or new clients, his progress at the company, the way the sea always seemed to heal them both. But as the wind quieted, Graham's tone changed. He stopped near the edge of the rocks, turning to face her. His hands, so often steady with papers and contracts, now held something small and velvet. He opened it, and the diamond within caught the sunlight, scattering brilliance across the waves. "Claire," he said, his voice low but sure. "I built my life on order, on strength, on walls I thought would protect me. You broke through them with kindness, with truth. I don't want to stand alone anymore. Will you marry me not as my secretary, not as someone I protect, but as my equal?" The wind lifted her hair, and for a moment she could not breathe. The diamond sparkled, but it was his eyes that held her, gray, steady, stripped of armor. She thought of the journey behind them, the whispers, the trial, the nights of exhaustion, the morning she had stood at the harbor and chosen to begin again. Her throat tightened, but she managed to smile. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, steadier. "Yes." Graham slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling only slightly. The band fit perfectly, gleaming against her skin. The gulls cried overhead, the sea roared below, and for the first time in a long while, Claire felt entirely at peace. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the waves fill her. When she opened them, Graham was still watching her, a quiet awe in his expression. They stood there together, the lighthouse behind them, the horizon stretching wide. The world had not grown easier, but it had grown honest. And in honesty, they had found not only survival, but love. As they turned back toward the path, the ring glinted in the fading light, a promise carried forward. Claire slipped her hand into his, no longer secretary and CEO, no longer divided by scandal or silence. Just two people, equals at last, walking together into the life they had chosen. And as the gulls wheeled above them, their cries sharp against the sea, the harbor seemed to bless their union with every crashing wave. The story began in a glass tower, but its ending was written on the open sea of trust. Seasons turned, and the city shifted as it always did. Yet for Claire and Graham, the rhythm of life no longer pulsed with secrecy or storms. It moved with steadier tides, the kind that carried ships home safely after long voyages. Whitman Consulting grew beyond the apartment, beyond even the modest Cambridge office. Within 2 years, the firm occupied a floor overlooking the Charles River. The windows stretched wide, sunlight spilling across desks, where her team now, a dozen strong, worked with quiet diligence. Each file reviewed, each audit completed, bore the same seal of integrity that had marked Claire's first folder. Transparency was not just policy, it was culture. Clients returned, not because she promised miracles, but because she delivered truth. Ellison Maritime, too, had changed. Graham steered the company with openness that once would have been unthinkable. Board meetings no longer bristled with suspicion, but opened with accountability. Crews on the docks noticed the difference. Inspections became thorough. Repairs timely. Safety drills, once perfunctory, turned real and practiced. Ships left harbor with confidence, not fear. Profits came. Yes, but they came from trust, not shortcuts. Together, Claire and Graham established the Mariners Fund, a foundation devoted to families like Anna Torres's, who had once received groceries from Claire's own hands. The fund grew quickly, fed by donations from companies and unions alike. Widows received stipends without delay. Children of lost mariners were granted scholarships. At annual gatherings, families stood and spoke of how the fund had carried them through. Voices breaking, eyes shining. Each story reminded Claire why she had chosen the harder road. Evenings found Claire and Graham not in boardrooms, but at home by the harbor or on quiet drives north. Their partnership was no longer shadowed by questions of hierarchy. She was not his secretary, and he was not her rescuer. They were two leaders, two equals, who had walked through fire and chosen to build together. Still, reflection lingered. Claire often thought back to that first day, her shoes clicking against the marble floor, her smile caught in Graham's unexpected gaze. Could she have imagined then what that moment would cost and what it would give? Perhaps not. Yet, storms, she realized, had shaped them more deeply than calm ever could. The glass tower, once intimidating, no longer held power over her. She could walk past its shining windows and feel only gratitude, for without it, without the whispers and the trial, without the pain of scandal and the courage of standing, she would not have found this life. One autumn evening, as gulls wheeled above the seaport, Graham joined her on the pier. The air smelled of salt and wood smoke, the sky painted with streaks of gold. He slipped his hand into hers, the diamond on her finger catching the last light of day. "Do you ever wish it had been easier?" he asked quietly. Claire smiled, her eyes on the horizon. No. Love endures not because it escaped trials, but because it walked through them. They stood there together, the harbor alive with sound, the cry of gulls, the churn of water, the faint hum of distant engines. Behind them, the city lights flickered on, one by one, like stars. Theirs was no fairy tale, polished and perfect. It was something sturdier, built from truth and tested by storms. And in its imperfection lay its strength. As the night deepened, Claire thought of all who might hear their story, those who had faced whispers, who had carried burdens unseen, who had wondered if honesty could survive in a world that often rewarded shadows. She turned to the audience of her own thoughts, to anyone listening across the waves of time. Would you risk everything for one honest smile? The harbor gave no answer, only the eternal rhythm of tide against stone. But perhaps, she thought, the question was the answer. And hand in hand, they walked into the night, their path lit not by towers of glass, but by trust, by love, and by the enduring light on the water. In the end, Claire's story is not just about boardrooms, scandals, or even love. It is about the quiet strength of choosing integrity when compromise seems easier. She teaches us that dignity is not built in grand gestures, but in small acts of care, the polished plaque, the corrected invoice, the letter to a widow. Each act seemed ordinary, yet together they created a foundation strong enough to withstand storms. For those of us who have lived long enough to know life's tempests, Claire reminds us that courage often hides in daily choices. To tell the truth when silence would be safer, to show kindness when the world rewards ambition, to risk being misunderstood rather than betray what feels right in the heart. And perhaps most of all, her story shows that love endures not because it avoids hardship, but because it walks through trials and still chooses to stay. That is a lesson for any age the storms may come, but they need not define us. What defines us is how we meet them with honesty, with tenderness, and with the faith that even a single smile can change the course of a life. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories. If Claire's journey touched your heart, we invite you to keep walking with us. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story of courage, hope, and healing. Your support keeps these stories alive.